They are extremely happy to co-own a Dutch nuclear plant, make good money operating a Dutch nuclear plant just across the border, right? It's just in Germany that they are making investments against the turn on of nuclear. So we got to put RW in their little lignite box and put them over to the side in this conversation. There's sort of entrenched state bureaucracies that are filled with lifelong green activists. Is that a problem? Yes, but in the right situation, they're German, they will obey. So when they are told they have to do something, they will eventually obey. That is my finding of Germans, they obey.
Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Triangle Investor Interviews. I'm your host Lucian Valkovic, and before I announce my guest, just a reminder of a disclaimer. This interview and all my interviews are not a recommendation to buy, sell any shares, products or services. Always do your due diligence, consult with your financial advisor. That said, my guest today is Mark Nelson, Managing Director of Radiant Energy Group. Mark, it has been almost a year since our last interview. Welcome back.
Thank you. Fortunately, nothing has happened in nuclear in that time, so we have nothing to catch up on. We can make it a
totally.
short
Yeah,
5-minute
I
podcast,
agree
right?
100%. That said, I don't know where to start. Let's cover. Maybe we should start with Germany. No, we should start with Chicago. What were you doing over there?
So I'm located here in Chicago, and very interesting things that are almost like a microcosm of issues affecting the rest of the energy and the rest of the nuclear world are happening here. First of all, we're the biggest city in the world that's basically 100% powered by nuclear. It's about 8 million people in the city and the surrounding communities, and in those surrounding communities and just outside is about 8 gigawatts of nuclear power. So 8 gigawatts of nuclear power, 8 million people. It's in perfect balance, as all things should be. Now, Chicago doesn't own any nuclear plants. It's just powered by them. And the nuclear plants are not really appreciated by the city of Chicago. They don't know about them. If they do know about them, it's to attack them. That's most of the case. Now, those nuclear plants, they've long needed Chicago. Chicago's needed the nuclear plants but hasn't appreciated it. The nuclear plants needed the Chicago to buy their power. Well, we're in the new world. Probably the biggest single thing to catch up on in the year since we've talked, Lucian, is that AI demand is huge and it's caused the West to wake up. You might think that all of the clean energy crisis and saying we need to switch all the cars to electric and we need to put every heating source on the grid, none of that actually led to really taking spiking electricity demand seriously. In part because the most powerful and richest leading companies were the tech companies who didn't think that all that stuff really applied to them. All they had to do was buy their carbon credits and that was fine, right? But what changed is that the tech companies in the West became the new richest, hungriest, thirstiest, leading power customers, which meant that they had to learn about electricity for the first time in their electricity using existence, which meant that the electricity for these big tech companies was no longer being seen as like a marketing game to play with investor rating portfolios to say who was more moral than who. No. That day was done. It was serious go time because you needed to power super data centers as soon as possible before your opponent did. Why does this connect to Chicago? Because if you take a city like Chicago, the demand 24/7, 365, concentrated in one spot. I mean, its city is big, but it's not that big. It's kind of like a data center. It's like a big data center. And for the first time, we have the tech companies that had been at war with industrial electricity. They've been fighting it to try to get rid of industrial electricity, claiming we don't need it. We're better than that. We're using renewables. Suddenly, they needed industrial electricity, and they knew they needed industrial electricity. And not just that, the tech companies in the last year have apparently decided they need quantities of industrial electricity that are comparable to that of the entire city of Chicago at a time. So, to catch this up, suddenly the tech companies go from being at war against things like nuclear plants, thinking that it didn't apply to them, to suddenly needing multiple nuclear plants just for themselves. Well, in the West, we haven't been building nuclear, so any nuclear plant that's sitting there, like the ones on the outskirts of Chicago, they're already powering Chicago. Whether Chicago knows it or not, the nuclear plants are powering Chicago. So then the biggest tech companies in the world in the last 24 months suddenly think, oh, we actually need all that nuclear. Can we buy it? Which sets up a very interesting case. So I really love nuclear. I want to see more nuclear. I think it's good for the world. I think it's good for my family here in Chicago. But we have a small issue. If Chicago isn't going to build any more nuclear plants, but Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Google are going to come and buy up the nuclear power, what happens to Chicago? What we're seeing is a pretty nasty edge of sort of, I don't want to call it protectionism, Lucia, but for example, there's a nuclear plant in Maryland. Maryland barely seemed to care that there was a nuclear plant in Maryland. They didn't need it expanded. They didn't need to include it in the carbon-free program. Now, at least in Maryland, power prices are high enough that the nuclear plant was doing okay. Not great, not terrible, but doing okay, right? Suddenly, Maryland, nuclear, so close to DC, it's data center heaven, right? So you would think the data centers would want to come in and buy nuclear power. So suddenly Maryland says, not so fast. Even though we aren't going to pay you any extra for your nuclear power, for its climate potential, for stabilizing the grid, no. We're just going to ban you from bringing in new customers to your nuclear plant until you pay renewables developers a huge truckload of money to put renewables in the wrong spot.
That's very interesting.
And that policy thinking is spreading through the renewables, like sort of this kind of weird mix of the quote-unquote environmentalists, not really environmentalists. They're just like, don't build anything, but definitely only build renewables, right? It's the anti-nuclear, traditional, like degrowth environmentalists. They have like been co-opted by or have co-opted the renewables complex. So now this thinking is going along the different policy networks used by the renewables lobbyists, right? So this thinking of don't allow somebody to come in and use the stable nuclear power in a state until you force them to pay off a huge amount of money to build new renewables in the wrong spot that they don't even need power over there. They need it by the nuclear plant where it's stable, right? So there are people trying to force new customers to pay off non-nuclear power plants before they get permission to use the nuclear power that's right next to the data center.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
But you see the problem.
Yeah, of course.
There's a nuclear plant already built. Nobody's building an extra nuclear plant. What happens when 1 million people's worth of data center comes and parks next to a nuclear plant that isn't growing? What do? I'm not saying it's a simple problem where you just either let everybody come and build no matter what, or I'm saying we need this to come together. We need to both expand the nuclear plants with long-term contracts at reasonably high prices that support the development of these expensive and excellent power plants, and we need to not just let tell Chicago you can go eat renewables somewhere else. We can't move Chicago. Chicago's stuck in place, right? We cannot move the city to jump over the nuclear plants and go to the prairie and try to get renewables or whatever. That wouldn't work for multiple reasons, even if you could lift the city over there. So we need a way for the nuclear and the cities to work together to overcome the anti-nuclear sort of enviro-renewables complex that's not able to accept that their power isn't steady enough. It's not good enough for either data centers or, by proxy, the cities whose demand is like a data center. So I think I'll stop my rant there and just to say Chicago's the biggest, greatest nuclear-powered metropolis. That's why they chose a pope from Chicago. So he could bring the light of nuclear energy from Chicago to the whole world, along with Chicago dogs, Chicago-style pizza, and I'm sure a number of other great Chicago traditions that I'll be able to share with you and your listeners as the Pope's influence grows.
Yeah, and Chicago Bulls, big fan.
I wouldn't go that far.
Okay. Let's move to always a hot topic in nuclear, that is Germany. Germany, as we know, shut down its last nuclear power plants in April 2023. A decision you criticized and as lacking safety or ecological justification as I. we are seeing some signs of life that Germany might reconsider its nuclear phase out. Do you see any realistic political or economic pathways for Germany to return to nuclear in the near future? And generally, what's your take on this?
Yes, there is a path. Unfortunately, politicians aren't going to lead on it. They have to be led. Meaning we have to create a business case, and Germans have to create a social license case for restarting these reactors, and then the politicians will follow. The politicians are perfectly aware that an enormous amount of damage was done to the country, including the politicians now taking power. It was their party that ultimately had to enforce the green dogma. I mean, didn't have to, they chose to. So Merkel chose to endorse the green dogma, which is what sucked all the life and all the hope out of the nuclear industry in Germany, that they were, quote, stabbed in the back by their own supporter that they thought would deliver them a few extra quiet decades of operation from the Greens. So the nuclear industry will not do the leading. The utilities are actively fighting. So if you have to find an evil group anywhere, it's definitely a utility like, say, RWE that knows way more about energy than the politicians do. They are much more sophisticated than the politicians. They are telling the politicians there's no way to turn on the nuclear. They're privately saying the opposite. Of course there's a way to turn on the nuclear. They're telling the politicians there isn't. They're telling the journalists there isn't. They're telling everyone else, of course, but we're not going to do it because it's too political. And then they're waiting for the nuclear question to be gone so that they can ask for tens of billions of euros in public subsidies for imported fossil fuels. So the utilities are, I mean, I get it. They're traumatized. It's very sad that you were forced to shut down your best assets. But, you know, RWE is perfectly aware of the value of the nuclear plants. They are extremely happy to co-own a Dutch nuclear plant and make good money operating a Dutch nuclear plant just across the border, right? It's just in Germany that they are making investments against the turn on of nuclear. So we got to put RWE in their little lignite box and put them over to the side in this conversation. There's sort of entrenched state bureaucracies that are filled with lifelong green activists. Is that a problem? Yes, but in the right situation, they're German, they will obey. So when they are told they have to do something, they will eventually obey. That is my finding of Germans, they obey. So we need to figure out a way to give a path forward so that all the Germans who don't want it just obey, and the Germans that do want it see a practical way of turning it on. Recent polling finds between about a half to just over half of the German public wants to see the nuclear turn back on. Even if they don't want new nuclear built, there's a significant fraction of the population that is against new builds but does want to see the German nuclear plants back on. We have to make a golden pathway so that it's an easy proposal, a winning proposal for the politicians.
Yeah,
Here's the biggest thing. The biggest insight about the German plants is, before being turned off, they were among the very best in the world, holding multiple world records for best lifetime performance, highest power output, extremely low staffing levels for even single unit plants with staffing levels sometimes half of American full-time staffing, but with as good a performance or better. I mean, that's pretty spectacular, right? And these are plants that were engineered for essentially immortality, like to run forever. The only things you couldn't replace, there's a big hatch in the side, you just move them in and out and replace them. So everything inside a nuclear reactor designed to be replaced in the German plants, whereas that would be a tricky thing in a lot of the nuclear plants in the world, replacing something large like a reactor vessel. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen. We haven't had to do that in the West, but it's just if you're designing for immortality, you would do it the way the Germans did.
Yeah,
Right.
let's say they decide to bring them back online. What kind of cost are we talking here, and what is the timeline of returning one nuclear power plant back online?
Well, there's a range. So the easiest plants to turn back on are the ones where almost nothing has been done. They've shuffled around parts of the turbine. They've flushed out the system, awaiting further dismantling. They've maybe cut a few electronic parts that would need to be replaced, but otherwise very little has occurred. There's only a few plants where that's the case. Ironically, where the plants are best preserved, it's because of the state environmental authority being filled with greens that don't approve anything. So if you have to approve every single step in the decommissioning pathway, and you demand more and more reports and more interference with the companies, that's actually something that's been in the favor of preserving some of these nuclear plants, as opposed to Bavaria, where the government itself is pro-nuclear in Bavaria. They've been cutting apart the nuclear reactors so fast. They've if you make a ranking of all the nuclear reactors, to answer your question, let's say you rank 11. 11 nuclear reactors would be substantially cheaper and faster than new build. Beyond 11, it would be shaky. You would hope that we could new build maybe the same cost, but maybe a little bit faster than the complexity of restoring heavily dismantled sites. And then beyond that, it's brownfield and you just replace it. So 11 reactors, where the most expensive of these maybe 4 or 5 billion euros for one of the reactors to turn it back on. The cheapest, a few hundred million. In terms of timing, we have different opinions about what would be the key longest lead time thing that would constrain your schedule. Our thought is that if you took today as your starting gun to the race, let's say it's an emergency, like Germany in an emergency, 10 years of planning and permissions and construction time for a natural gas terminal, it shrank down to about 9 months. Yeah, if we have that level of urgency, how long? We like to think that 18 months, give or take a little, is about what it would take to put the best plants, the most preserved plants back into operation. There's some debate about how much time it would take to train new operators on simulators. But honestly, there are simulators for German-style plants, different places in the world, not just in Europe. We would find a way to make it work. Astronaut style, we would just figure out a way to get people simulator time and get the most elite and most dedicated people returning to work for these jobs, get them on the leading units as you restart the fleet in a sort of a zip line. You concentrate all of the abilities that are being used in Germany to tear apart nuclear. You concentrate them on, well, first you stop tearing apart any of the 11 that you intend to keep. Then you reconcentrate 24 hours a day if you need to refurbishing the reactors in the top 2 or 3 or 4, pack of 2 or 3 or 4 reactors that you need done. And then you would get the operators who wanted to return to their jobs, get those in first, especially if they're already certified for the make and model. And then you would use those operators and you'd use simulator time to recertify. All of this gets you to very approximately 18 months. For the couple €100 million reactors, that's what we're looking at. For the couple billion euro reactors for restoration, we're thinking maybe, if we're being conservative, 2032 before all of those come back online, depending on how they're prioritized or how quickly you want to return the most dismantled reactors to service.
Okay, if the government persists in phasing out of the nuclear, how much time would it take to dismantle one power plant?
Well, clearly they're going a lot faster in Bavaria, where they love nuclear, compared to the green states where they hate nuclear and they're preserving the. They're practically they're practically mothballing some of these plants rather than dismantling, where the Greens control the local ministries. And then in the ministries where they love nuclear and wish they could turn them back on, they're rubber stamping everything to tear them apart. Which, by the way, when I say Germans obey, that's the sort of stuff I'm talking about. Germans will do something directly against their beliefs, their interests, everything. If they've been ordered to do it, they will do it, right? So that's a disadvantage in some cases, historically, and a huge advantage in other cases where it's time to do the right thing. They can all fall in line and do the right thing, right? So when the mission is set and it's right, they can do the right thing. The government, in order to keep the dismantling going, needs to do nothing. So this is the big problem. In order to stop the dismantling, something likely must be done. Now, if people wanted to buy the nuclear plants, it's not likely that the utilities would be interested in selling until they knew that they never had to touch nuclear again. Right? There's already money being paid out to decommission these reactors. Money that's been collected, money that's being paid out. Anybody that says, time out, stop, that is incurring a change to the plan. And then you ask who actually pays for this, who covers the cost of stopping the dismantling. If we're going to stop this dismantling, it's because somebody has figured out a pathway that a politician calling for this stop is not thrown out of office or not thrown, let me just clarify something, by the way. You didn't ask this yet. A lot of people think there's no hope to save these reactors because for over this government period, for the next, 2, 3, 4 years, 4 years possibly, a government's going to be in place that made no statement on restarting nuclear. However, they very much did not make any statement on not restarting nuclear. And the way the German legal world looks, anything that is not excluded is very literally and implicitly, but quite strongly permitted. German law is the most specific and extreme in the world in its literalness and adherence to small details, okay? So the coalition agreement is not like law, but it kind of holds a cultural, in the government, it holds that cultural role. The left-wing Social Democrats Party and the conservatives, the centrist conservatives, have come together. They've made an agreement. That agreement was held up for over a week on just the issue of nuclear, and the compromise was basically, we will not talk about nuclear in any way in this agreement. So there, 4 years. You asked me, how long could we still save nuclear? Could we save nuclear if we had this happen? 4 years went by. Maybe, but only in the states where the Greens are obstructing dismantling. And I hope that I don't trigger them to undisrupt dismantling. Do not translate this into German and send it to state government Greens. That's what I ask from you. Okay, Lucian?
Okay,
But
no worries.
I think that we would still have a few reactors that might be so mothballed, they might be able to come back. I mean, there's a reactor that was turned off over a decade ago, and it could be, it has not been touched. And it's over 1,000 megawatts. It's desperately needed by Germany and has not been touched. So there's an example that says, I'm not going to call a time limit where I give up. I will never, ever give up on Germany, okay? Even if we go down fighting here, I think that it means we rise faster. I think that German technical abilities and know-how are extraordinary, and if they're not needed in Germany, better to keep them hot and ready to use them in other countries, yeah? I think that the folks that I've met quietly in the German nuclear industry that quietly support our effort but can't say much publicly because they don't want to incur the wrath of the utilities trying to crush all conversation of restarts, they are extraordinary. And I would do anything, I think, if I didn't care about Germany, to bring them over to America and get them involved in American new builds and American uprates and stuff like that. Their abilities, their skills are, they're rightfully legendary in Germany. They just need to be legendary outside of Germany. They've been stuck just kind of like tearing apart these German nuclear plants, but I think that the fight for the nuclear plants alone has revealed to me and my team the full capabilities, and we plan to take good use of them, hopefully in Germany, but if not, outside of Germany. To conclude this long, weird answer, I'm not putting a time limit when the last day is to save the plant. We don't know what weird geopolitical happenings, what weird election results, which, could come sooner rather than later if Germany's government is unstable and the coalition falls apart early. That's why we had the elections when we did. Coalition fell apart day after Trump got elected, We don't know what's going to happen. I'm not going to put a timeline on it. There may be something to save in 5 years. Maybe there's nothing to save in 2 years if things really accelerate. Either way, I'll keep fighting.
Yeah, keep up with the good fight. Let's move to Spain. We had a blackout in Spain that disrupted millions of lives and raised questions about the country's nuclear phase-out. What do you believe really caused the massive grid failure, and how does it reflect the challenges of relying heavily on renewables?
So let me just come out and say it. Bad management of renewables, likely because it was cheaper to badly manage the renewables than it was to manage them properly. Can you manage this level of renewables well? Almost certainly, but it's not going to be as cheap as what they were doing. And it would still remain to be seen what you do after you forced the nuclear plants to leave and all the other fossil, or if you actually tried to electrify further. So, although I'm not going to say you will inevitably have such a blackout if you rely as heavily on renewables as Spain did, if you try to rely on renewables the way Spain did without spending even more money than Spain spent, you are definitely putting yourself up for a blackout like this. So, I don't think we want to make this answer about grid inertia and say, well, there's this property of grids called inertia, and I'm just going to say renewables were using the grid but not forming the grid, shall we say. You can pay more to add equipment and change the way you operate the renewables in order to force them to contribute more to the grid stability. That will need to be done. That will almost certainly be done in Spain. They might not have a blackout quite like this again. But partly that's because the message has been gotten across to Europe. A lot of people can look at the Texas blackout and see that there was almost no wind output from a huge wind fleet during the Texas blackouts. It was a type of blackout from not having enough power generally. What happened in Spain, I think, scared Europeans for two reasons. One, I think Europeans like to think they manage things better than we do and like have better trains and public goods they think of as better than in America. And I think this was a big wake-up call that no, you can have European cascading blackouts, okay? Two, it happened when there was an immense amount of renewables. So this wasn't a blackout from not having enough energy per se. Now, we could go into detail and say, was it the right energy at the right place, the right time, controlled with the right electronics? Was it? But there was no shortage of solar. There was no shortage of available power plants that just weren't running because they weren't needed. So this was a slap across the face of Europeans saying, no, you aren't so special. You can have blackouts with unpredictable political consequences. Thank God this was a blackout in a very gentle time of year for weather and for demand. And thankfully it was in like an Iberian peninsula that is sort of kind of deindustrializing a little, and maybe it's a little bit less serious that you have a few hours without power in a country. I don't know. I'll let the Europeans speak for themselves. I saw posts from degrowthers saying, oh, we just had a holiday. That shows that we're really chill in Spain and can make do with less. Okay, well, I'm going to put that aside and just be happy here in nuclear-powered Chicago and let other people hash that one out. Here's what I've heard. This got the attention of European Union leaders, who then started to learn about nuclear for the first time in their lives. This Spanish blackout, I've heard in other European capital cities, being referred to as Solar's Fukushima. By that, I think there's some real depth of meaning. Where was the cause of Fukushima Daiichi? Was that Japan's mismanagement? Was it a bad reactor design? Was it unlucky location? Was it bad, whatever. You can stack up all the things that led to that. But broadly, Fukushima was bad for nuclear in a place where they had plenty of nuclear and believed in its future, right? That it was something that punctured a narrative of inevitability that had grown up outside of, say, the Chernobyl zone of, oh, well, in Western nuclear, we don't have Chernobyls, right? So it punctured an era of invulnerability. That is what I think is what is being meant in European capital cities when people say this was Solar's Chernobyl or Solar's Fukushima. There was an era of inevitability, especially in sunny Spain, that we're going to phase out our nuclear, we don't need it, and we've proven to the world renewable only can work.
Spain generates about 20% of its electricity from nuclear. So do you believe really that the recent blackout could shift public and political? You mentioned European Union. However, what about local? Do you believe that this could shift public and political opinion toward keeping power plants operational?
Yes. Spain is a weird phase out. Spain is maybe one of the most clever phase outs I've ever seen, where the government got all the utilities together and said, we will destroy you. We will crush you. Let's figure out a way so that you choose not to be crushed by us, by you exiting and you taking the blame for turning off your own nuclear plants. Got it? So it's similar to how Diablo Canyon was being turned off in California, where the governor, the current governor, the assistant governor, the lieutenant governor at the time, sat down with the utilities and said, are we doing this the easy way or the hard way? The hard way is I just crush you. The easy way is you crush yourself and then blame yourself, and in return you get a few years of peace and quiet to slip into retirement, right? So the Spanish phase out is a Diablo Canyon style phase out. Diablo Canyon is a good example too because it's the last remaining plant in the state. It was like 10% of power depending on how you measure it. Coastal, a lot of climate things the same. Huge amount of solar. And then one little scary blackout in 2020, one little blip, and suddenly the powers that be, their political careers flash before their eyes, and they start working on maybe is there a way to reverse course, but make it the utilities idea, not mine. So I think that, electricity is an interesting thing in that it's not understood by politicians until there's a blackout, or it's not taken seriously until there's a blackout, because engineer nerds are always whining and complaining and telling us what we can't do. But until there's a blackout, we think we can. In Spain, what I think we're going to see is we were already seeing, first of all, a giant public movement. So 12,000 people marched in Spain in January in support of their own nuclear plant. That is a serious mobilization, Lucian. The biggest thing I've ever been involved in is like a few thousand. It's just was pathetically small. The biggest ever was pathetically small compared to the 12,000 person march in Spain. So there was already a big political movement for some of the regions, the more pro-nuclear of the regions, to keep these plants. Then we had some statements from the nuclear plant owners for the first times ever saying, we love renewables, we do lots of renewables are cool, but maybe we need to find a way to keep the nuclear. Finally, this blackout hits, and I expect that we're going to see action. The level of propaganda around this blackout was suffocating from day one. Before the power was even back on, you had people jumping out and saying, nuclear people are going to talk about this, but it wasn't about that, and we don't know what it is from, but we do know it's not because of nuclear not being there. In fact, it's probably from nuclear that we have a blackout. We don't know anything, so don't jump to the conclusions. We just know it wasn't solar, and it was definitely nuclear, but otherwise we know nothing, so anybody who says anything is a propagandist. So that propaganda was suffocating and continues to roll out. What I call the vibes-based quasi-technical approach, where like people who have made their entire career in renewables preemptively say it wasn't from anything that is stuff that I've defended, so wait until we learn what it is from, as long as it isn't from the thing that I'm defending. That, I'm not going to say that doesn't come from nuclear people from time to time, but it came fast and heavy from the Spanish blackouts. People who didn't even know the word inertia were jumping in to claim it wasn't from inertia. Like people who had never really studied the grid before, who had always disregarded warnings, they were very quickly jumping in to say, well, we don't know what it is, so don't say it's anything that I don't want you to say. But it definitely isn't the things that I protect, and it is the things that you like. So that's going to happen no matter what, but I think the politicians, I don't think they're ever going to learn the details or care. They need there not to be blackouts. And they need other people not to run against them in the election saying, he's the blackout king. He's going to black you out. All of that stuff he did, that's blackouts. That's Blackout Bob. He makes blackouts. I don't think there's a good response to that in modern politics.
Yeah, a great response. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez claimed that nuclear facilities didn't help repower the grid during the blackout. But can we clarify to our audience the role of nuclear plants play in the grid stability, especially during such events?
Right. So the grid communicates with itself, stays synced up, stays linked up, lets people take power off and put power on by keeping a very tight heartbeat, a shared heartbeat, if you will, across the whole system. Do you have to have that nowadays? I don't know. I've seen very clever people argue that that's an outdated system for communicating with all the electronics on the grid. If power comes on and power comes off, we have all the electronics we need to just send and receive power without having this heartbeat connect everything. Be that as it may, at the moment we built our grids based on the heartbeat, okay? And if the heart cells aren't working together, you get arrhythmia and you get a heart attack. That's, I think, a decent metaphor for now. Restarting a heart may take different procedures than are useful for keeping that heartbeat going. You would not want to shock somebody repeatedly to get their heart to pump well, even if you gave them a shock from a defibrillator to get it to jumpstart it and get it moving, right? You would want the heart to keep going on its own, not have to shock it up at every moment. So there may be things that keep the heartbeat going well that are not the same thing as what you are required to do in an emergency to restart the heart. Let me just say that. So you could maybe even make an argument saying, for these reasons, nuclear didn't help us restart, and that is not at all a reason not to have nuclear. In fact, as you hinted at in asking me this question, not having enough nuclear may very well be a part of the reason you had the heart attack in the first place. Not enough drive, or not enough whatever it is that keeps things going. So I'm dancing around this because it's a brutally technical topic, but basically the way we keep this heartbeat on the grid going is enough cells that all keep firing together at the same time. This shared communication is done extremely well by the giant chunk of spinning metal that's rotating near the heart of a nuclear plant. The nuclear reactor uses that sweet, sweet uranium that everyone gets so excited about on your show. You put that uranium in, that makes heat, boil the water, water to steam. Steam turns a big turbine at a very specific speed that's turning a magnet at a very specific speed, surrounded by coils of wire, and that spinning magnet and the coils of wire around it, that's what creates the electromagnetic field, and the rate of spin is what sets the heartbeat effectively, or keeps the heartbeat going. The importance of this attribute of a nuclear plant, where the nuclear plant may be making power for, say, 1 million people or 2 million people, right? But it may be helping maintain the heartbeat for everything else on the grid. Should it need to? Should we put such a heavy burden on the nuclear plants? I don't know. Maybe Spain shouldn't have had that much a reliance on the same nuclear plants that they're trying to shut down to keep up this heartbeat. What appears to have happened in this blackout, as best as we can tell, and sure enough, the final story isn't out yet, is that once a bit of load was lost during a time when very little of this spinning metal from turbines in that heavy power plants, very little of this spinning metal was on the grid, and there was a huge amount of solar on the grid, it was not apparently able to respond correctly to disturbances in the heartbeat. So let's say your body starts running a little bit, the heart needs to, I'm already breaking the metaphor. In this case, heart needs to pump at the same rate, or beat at the same rate in the electricity grid, but not in the human heart. So already we break our metaphor. Let's just say the nuclear plants help stabilize the grid by resisting change to the heartbeat. And that with sufficiently few power plants with this capability on the grid, you have to spend a lot more to make the solar farms have this capability. That amount was not spent. That was bad management of renewables rather than per se renewables themselves, but that itself is splitting hairs. You know that level of splitting hairs would never be given to like why Fukushima happened or the difference between Chernobyl and another nuclear plant. The same people trying to split a hair so finely in a grid system they don't even understand to say whether it was or wasn't renewables' fault in defense of renewables, those same people would never do that fine a splitting, either for the benefits of having nuclear on the grid or why a nuclear accident in one area does not mean you shut off your nuclear plants in another.
Great overview. Final question. You've discussed France's energy resilience due to its nuclear commitment in contrast to Germany's struggles. What can countries like Spain and Germany learn from the French approach? That's my final question. I know it's a big question, but if you can answer it in 3-4 minutes.
France is making it very difficult to learn from their approach because of how they manage mismanage their electricity supply and their environmental policies. They've been like anti-nuclear degrowthers for long enough that it severely impacted the function and efficiency of the French nuclear system. They've torn down some of their best plants. They've had large replacements of parts that were ordered to be done by a overzealous regulator without regard to the true safety implications of the fix. They've really made it difficult to make an extremely strong argument. The only way you can point to the scoreboard and say, there's the evidence you need, is really the carbon numbers. The price difference between French and German electricity has been shrinking for a long time. Again, France has been very aggressively blowing up the cost of what should be a very cheap energy system. They've been aggressively adding renewables that force the nuclear plant to turn off, even though it doesn't save anybody any money, right? That is just insane mismanagement, right? Well, that's an example of France making the lesson that ought to be learned by other countries not so good. I think in the case of the Spanish blackout, the fact that the French grid just was like a barrier, a strong barrier that just said, "Oh, that's your blackout. Y'all deal with that. French grid is fine." I think that was something that people are noticing and is getting out there as a narrative and is physically true, so I don't mind it as a narrative. French nuclear can get a lot better, and this will make this narrative easier. At the moment, it really is kind of just super low carbon numbers that France can claim. I hope that several different improvements come on the horizon in France and make the price difference between French electricity and their neighbors' electricity back to the gap that it used to have before they started destroying their nuclear fleet. But yeah, I think that France having confidence in their leadership in Brussels, partly from having a nuclear weapon and partly from having a nuclear fleet, I am hoping that that confidence is as strong a signal as anything, as other countries look at the Spanish blackout and the German economic dysfunction as counterexamples. In other words, France should have electricity that's half the cost of Germany. They've mismanaged it up to where it's like a 30% discount, depending on whether you're talking residential or it's a bigger discount if you're talking industrial electricity, but it's not nearly the discount as it ought to be if France were managing its nuclear system correctly. So there you go. My big point is very low carbon and a new sense of destiny and of potential from being able to turn their nuclear fleet back up higher if they attract businesses to their country. I think that's going to be the really strong signal. I just wish that signal were stronger than it currently is, and I can't wait to either work alongside the French or cheer them on as they improve their power situation to take full advantage of their nuclear commitment from the 1970s.
That was Mark Nelson from Radiant Energy Group. We always learn something from Mark. That was a great learning session. Mark, thank you for coming to my show. As always, a great chat.
Thanks for having me, Lucian.